Welcome students to lesson 26 of the natural hazards topic. This is our final lesson, and in this lesson we will be discussing how to mitigate or prevent climate change. Please write the date, title and learning objective and have a pen and paper ready to learn. Time to review prior learning. Write 1 to 10, answer the questions from memory and then mark your answers. Game time. 1. Energy production. 2. Ocean acidification. 3. Diseases. 4. 45 gigatons. 5. Warmer. 6. Methane. 7. Eccentricity. 8. Warming. 9. 14,000. 10. Mount Etna. Give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 9 or more, excellent, you've mastered these questions. To introduce this lesson, I'm going to show you a photo and a question about it. And then I'm going to explain to you why we need to mitigate climate change. Carbon dioxide, when it's released into the atmosphere, can remain there for 200 years, meaning that the greenhouse effect, which has been strengthened by human activity, can be stronger for up to 200 years even after we stop releasing CO2. Therefore, in order to mitigate climate change, the change in temperature and precipitation, we need to not only stop releasing greenhouse emissions, but we need to find a way to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Only by doing this can we prevent the worst effects of climate change that have already begun but will only get more severe. So, the big issue of today is how to prevent climate change, and by this we mean mitigation. These are our problems, the things we're doing. Transport, releasing carbon dioxide emissions. Deforestation, the loss of our carbon sink, meaning more CO2 remains in the atmosphere. Cement manufacturing, releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. Agriculture, causing deforestation, but also cattle releasing methane into the atmosphere, a greenhouse gas. And energy production, directly releasing carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere. These are the main human activities that are causing global warming and climate change today. In order to mitigate climate change, we need to stop doing these things, or we need to do them differently. Let me show you how. The first step in mitigating climate change is getting countries around the world to agree to help. Because climate change is not caused by any one country, and so if any one country tries to stop climate change alone, it will be ineffective. Here is a pie chart showing the amount of CO2 released by different places in the world. As you can see, 2 countries contribute by far the most, with China double the second most with the USA. But even the USA is significantly more than the whole of Europe. In fact, it's just about 8 countries that contribute more than 3/4 of all global CO2 emissions. These 2 countries, therefore, it can be argued, are the most important when it comes to our efforts to mitigate climate change. These 2, above all, need to reduce their CO2 emissions. And if we can't make that happen, then efforts to mitigate climate change will fail. So how do we get China and the USA and the other countries in the world, in particular the HICs, agree to mitigate climate change? Well, we have an international agreement. In 2015, President Barack Obama of the USA and Premier Xi Jinping of China met, as well as hundreds of other leaders from around the world, in Paris. And in the Paris Climate Accords in 2015, several things were agreed in the efforts to mitigate climate change. The 2 most important were these. First, all countries would commit to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions to below their levels that they were producing in 1990. Second, all HICs, in particular the USA and Europe, would commit to helping LICs and NEEs to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by whatever means necessary. They would help by using their money and their skilled workers to help LICs. And finally, all countries, as a specific goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, would commit to keeping climate change below an increase in temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because it was understood by scientists that any more than 1.5 degrees would lead to significantly worse effects on people and the environment. How did the Paris Climate Agreement think that it would get these countries to commit? Well, one significant way was this. It's called a carbon tax. Right now, releasing CO2 doesn't cost a company or a country anything. They don't have to pay for it. And so, they have no reason to stop polluting. However, the Paris Climate Agreement tried to push countries to introduce a carbon tax in their countries so that every company and every person and every country as a whole would have to pay for the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that it released into the atmosphere. And through these payments, two things would happen. First, the countries would have more money to be able to spend on efforts to mitigate climate change. But second, by making carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases expensive, these countries and the people within them would want to pollute less. For instance, imagine you're a driver of a car, and every few weeks you go to the petrol station to fill up with petrol. But now the petrol is 25% more expensive because of a carbon tax placed on the pollution in the form of CO2 that petrol releases when it's burned in your car. You would probably drive the car less because it costs more. And what you might do is take more public transport, such as buses, or you might buy an electric car or cycle. And in doing so, you would reduce your carbon footprint, the amount of carbon dioxide you're contributing to the atmosphere. So the first step in mitigating climate change is making sure that every country agrees. One major example of an international agreement like this is the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. Second step. Once you have made countries commit to mitigating climate change, you need to put several strategies in place that will help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Please write the subtitle and underline it. The principal fossil fuels are coal, oil, and natural gas in the form of methane. When we burn these three fossil fuels, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the main greenhouse gas. We use fossil fuels for energy production and for transport in particular, but also for heating. So, if we want to mitigate climate change, we need to find another way of producing electricity. And here's what we do. We use alternative energy, such as solar power. Solar power uses the sun to create electricity. It releases no greenhouse gas emissions, and it never runs out. It's an example of renewable energy because it never runs out. Wind power. When wind blows across these wind turbines, the turbines spin, creating electricity. Again, they never run out and they release no greenhouse gases. Nuclear power. Some metals are what we call radioactive, which means they release heat naturally. For example, uranium. There is a very large supply of this around the world, meaning that a lot of electricity can be produced using nuclear power. Nuclear power also does not release any carbon dioxide. And finally, hydroelectricity. When you pump water through a dam like this, it spins a turbine as it passes through. That turbine, when it spins, turns a generator which generates electricity. These are the four main types of alternative energy. They are all renewable, they don't run out. with the exception of nuclear, but that will take hundreds of thousands of years to run out. None of them releases greenhouse gases, and consequently they are all what we call sustainable energy, meaning that two things happen. Number one, they provide electricity for our needs, for manufacturing, for heating, for our computers and our technology and our lights and our transport. Number two, they do not damage the natural environment or cause climate change. And because of these two things, meeting our needs and not damaging the environment, they are sustainable energy supplies. If we're going to mitigate climate change, we need to change from fossil fuels to renewable energy or alternative energy. This is easiest to achieve in HICs because they have the money to invest in these expensive technologies. But the price of these technologies is decreasing as more are manufactured, and so they're becoming more and more available around the world. This, for example, is in Egypt, a newly emerging economy, NEE. Final step. Carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for up to 200 years, meaning that if we install thousands of gigawatts of electricity in the form of renewable energy, and if we turn all our cars into electric cars, and if we ban significant amounts of agriculture, and if we commit to reducing our cement production, the CO2 that's in the atmosphere will remain there for 200 years, and so global warming will continue. So in order to prevent climate change from getting worse, we need to actually find ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. The first way is this. It's called afforestation. It means planting trees in areas where there weren't any before. The Trillion Tree project, run by an NGO called Plant for the Planet, has worked out that 1 trillion trees, such as these, can be planted around the world without needing to go onto the land taken up by cities or farmland. There's enough space for it. These trees, often fast-growing conifer trees like these, would absorb enormous amounts of carbon dioxide because their carbon sinks, and since they grow quite fast within 10 years, this effect on reducing the CO2 in the atmosphere would be felt relatively quickly. It's also a sustainable solution because not only does it provide people an income by providing them with jobs in terms of planting trees, but it also leads to the mitigation of climate change through the absorption of carbon dioxide. One limitation of afforestation is that it's quite slow. 10 years at least before the effects of this greater carbon sink are felt. Another is that it requires a lot of land, and many countries are reluctant, which means not enthusiastic about, planting trees in places where they could potentially have agriculture. So in order to encourage countries to invest in tree planting, HICs need to commit to support LICs by providing them with money in exchange. As well as afforestation, a much more expensive and advanced technology has been introduced. This is a rock taken from underground in Iceland. Iceland is a country northwest of Europe, and this rock has formed when carbon dioxide has turned into rock as it bonds with the rock deep underground. And it's called carbon capture, and it's a way of removing carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere using technology. And here's how it works. An NGO called ClimaWorks has built these devices, special fans, that suck in enormous amounts of air from the atmosphere every second. And as they do so, they fire the air into boiling hot water. That hot water has come from a geothermal power plant, of which there are many in Iceland because it's on a constructive plate boundary. As the CO2 meets the hot water which has risen up from underground, the carbon dioxide is dissolved in the water. It becomes carbonic acid. That hot water, which has carbonic acid dissolved in it, is then transferred underground. And the carbonic acid then causes chemical reactions with the rock deep underground, and the carbon dioxide solidifies into rock, forms pure carbon underground. The carbon dioxide has then left the water. It's no longer in the water. So as the water returns to the surface, it no longer contains carbon dioxide. This power station, geothermal power station, powers the system of absorbing carbon dioxide, heating the water, and transferring the carbon dioxide down underground, where it's locked underground forever as rock. This is called carbon capture and storage, and it is an effective way of reducing CO2 from the atmosphere, and it's sustainable because in Iceland they have very cheap renewable energy in the form of geothermal power, and it's effective because it removes permanently carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The problem with it is twofold. First, it's very energy intensive, means it requires a lot of energy in the form of electricity to pump that water with carbon dioxide in it underground. Second, unless you have renewable energy powering it, then you're going to be releasing CO2 in the form of carbon emissions from the fossil fuel burning. And so, it's an expensive technology. It's mostly used in HICs. Two countries in particular, the United States of America and Iceland, have begun using this technology. But, as a result of the Paris Climate Agreement, the United States of America and other HICs have committed to investing in researching ways to capture carbon and store it underground much more cheaply. In doing so, we would be able to reduce the number of years that the current carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, and so we could more quickly reduce the greenhouse effect, and this would lead to more rapid global cooling, which would very effectively mitigate climate change. So these three steps, getting countries to agree, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by investing in alternative energy, and directly removing CO2 from the atmosphere, if we combine them effectively, we can mitigate climate change. Please write 1 to 8. Answer the questions from memory and then mark your answers. 1. Afforestation. 2. Carbon sink. 3. Carbon capture. 4. Geothermal. 5. Renewable. 6. CO2. 7. Paris. 8. Tax. Give yourselves a mark out of 8. If you got 7 or more, you've really understood these questions. Time to embed learning. Make sure you practice these questions and write in full sentences. Then mark your answers in green pen. So, international agreements, how do they encourage countries to mitigate climate change? You need this first point for 2 marks, and then you need any of these. I would strongly encourage you to add all of these to your answers in green pen, at least in bullet point form, using the underlined parts. 2. Alternative energy and afforestation. So make sure you explain clearly and exactly how I have, how these 2 methods would mitigate climate change. Give yourselves a mark out of the total. If you got 7 or more, you've mastered these questions. Well done. From this lesson, write 2 questions from memory. Answer them, and then in a week's time, test yourselves on all the questions you've written from the natural hazards topic. Thank you so much for joining me for Natural Hazards. Take time over the next few weeks to review the lessons that you've learned and attempt the test questions again, especially the try questions, to make sure that you've really remembered and understood them.